is Brunei, a very small country, but a very wealthy country. And they actually have very broad coverage. They don't have any exceptions about their coverage, but they do get higher thresholds, but just for 2 years. So I think theirs is going to be a fairly typical coverage at that point. I'm going to stop here because I could, as others, go on forever. But I think this gives you just a quick overview of the program chapter.
Jean, thank you. Derek, state-owned enterprises is part of every elevator speech on TPP. What about the substance of the rules, the exceptions? Does this help to level the playing field between private companies and state-owned enterprises?
I could speed things up by saying no, and then we could be done. So I'm critical of TPP from the free trade side. I read the whole thing twice now, and I'm really resisting having to read it a third time. The thing that I object to most is actually non-conforming measures and services, but I know more about SOEs. So we're supposed to motivate your topic. Here's my motivation for why SOEs matter. China. Now I'm done with my motivation. Let's move on. To credit my TPP, my friends at USTR, there is a clear and valuable improvement in transparency requirements for SOEs. And to understand the situation, they're likely, almost certainly constrained by U.S. defensive interests, which I think my colleagues have touched on here. I hate U.S. defensive interests. In trade, I'm a free trader. Can't stand them. If you represent them, I don't like your job. You're probably a wonderful person, but I resent you anyway. What did not happen, this is not a case of, we need to tinker a little bit. The SOE chapter, other than transparency, just doesn't do what it's supposed to do, in my view. And I'll justify that by saying the following thing. We don't recognize why SOEs exist and what their intrinsic impact is in this chapter. They exist because governments don't want profit-maximizing firms to perform certain roles. So pretending you're going to make SOEs act like profit-maximizing firms is just covering your eyes and saying, I don't know why they're there, but I'll just assume they're going to be better. They're not. That's not why they're created in the first place. SOEs that don't act like profit-maximizing firms automatically harm any competing firm. So presuming that you're going to be able to stop the harm to a competing firm is also unrealistic. No party shall cause adverse effects to the interest of another party through the use of non-commercial assistance that it provides. That's ridiculous. Non-commercial assistance, meaning we're going to give you different than commercial assistance and somehow we're not going to harm your commercial interests. That's ludicrous. Right? So the point of this chapter doesn't make any sense to me. I understand why it occurred. I like the transparency provisions, but this isn't something you can tinker with. The only way you can apply this chapter is if the SOEs apply this chapter usefully is that SOEs operate solely, including inputs, in a sector that no one else wants to operate in. Otherwise, non-commercial assistance says SOEs automatically injures another party by reducing market access. SOEs don't face commercial bankruptcy. Unless there is never any other production possible, they automatically displace competing production, contra the claim in the TPP that you're not allowed to displace competing production. The same thing is true, and it's more complicated, in terms of providing financial support through financial SOEs. So the whole construction of Chapter 17, in my view, is wrong. Now, I understand why we didn't try to take the bull by the horns here, and there may be good reasons, and there are a lot of other chapters. So you can just say, fine, we swung and missed on SOEs for good political reasons, and we should pass the TPP anyway. I don't actually agree with that, but I mean, that's a totally reasonable argument. What I'm worried about, and what all of you should be worried about who are pro-TPP in an election year, is the China side of this. Temasek is a very irritating entity. Singapore's standard enterprise, as is GIC, as is Japan Post, as are Fannie and Freddie, as is Brunei Oil. But we have a handful of them in the current agreement. But we're going to extend these terms to other countries, which has been talked about. That makes for a much bigger problem. And the biggest problem in the country that has by far the largest and most sophisticated state sector is China. And it's not unfair, as was brought up in a Republican debate, for me to bring up China because the president always brings up China. And then he did it, like I'm going to mention TPP for about 5 seconds under my breath, but I'm going to say China. We have to make the rules so China doesn't. Well, we just made rules China's totally fine with. In the matter of SOEs, which along with IP is the key thing for deciding whether you want China to join or not. Chinese firms, SOEs don't act like private firms, they're not going to. The non-commercial assistance has harmed other parties, and they displaced an enormous amount of competing world production, and none of this will be changed if China were to join the TPP on these terms, or, to a lesser extent with smaller countries. You can create subnational companies that skip the terms. You can route more asset control through sovereign wealth funds. I could draw this up for most countries in like 5 minutes, how to get around the TPP SOE chapter done. And you could say, a lot of the parties don't want to do that. They don't want to get around the chapter. I agree. But Singapore does, Vietnam does, Malaysia does, a lot of countries outside do. That's why they set up the SOEs in the first place. The chapter doesn't take that motivation seriously. So what are the solutions? You could tinker, take out some of the non-conforming measures in SOEs, lower the ownership threshold. Right now, you can have a 50%, essentially 50% share ownership, 50% of the board, divide the rest up among the little private firms, and that's not an SOE. It's just silly. Right? We don't think 50% ownership is required to control a company. Depends on the structure of ownership elsewhere. So you could do that. I just will subject more firms to rules that, in my opinion, miss the point. The real solution is you have to try to address SOEs, which is scrap a lot of the chapter, and replace it with an approach that says, look, we're not going to be able to keep you from providing harmful non-commercial assistance. We're not going to be able to keep you from displacing competing production. That's the whole point of your setting SOEs up in the first place. What we're going to do is shrink over time the number of sectors in which SOEs are legitimate. And we didn't try to do that. And we could do it. How well we could do it is a different story, but that's the right approach. Phase it in for the Vietnamese. They certainly need it. Tell Singapore, look, you can have your SWFs. They just can't operate in certain sectors. What do they need to be operating in retail for? Why do we need a state hand in retail? So there is progress to be made there that would actually limit SOEs. We didn't take it. Now, the last thing I'm going to say, because we should get to questions, is I hear when I say this, people say, look, we can't renegotiate all this. And then I hear from the business community, well, we have all these things we want to talk to the administration about, which sounds like some sort of renegotiation. Then I hear from my friends who negotiate with China, oh, we never let the Chinese in under these terms, meaning we're going to be renegotiating the terms anyway. I don't, somehow renegotiating is totally unreasonable in one area, but it's completely reasonable in several other areas. If you love the TPP, you're not worried about SOEs down the line, you might accept my objection and say, fine, let's move on. The agreement's not going to be perfect. If you're on balance on the TPP, or you're thinking about dealing with Chinese construction firms in third markets, good luck. This is a tough sell for you. So I don't think this is the most important issue in the world, but I think it's a pretty clear one. TPP swings and misses.
Derek, thank you. Terrific.